Bun găsit, doamnelor, domnilor, sunt Marius Constantinescu. Astăzi, la Ediție limitată, vine un autor american de mare, mare șarm, despre care am putea spune că parcă ar fi coborât din romanele sale. Amor Towles.
Amor Towles, thank you so much for taking the time to answer some questions coming from me, but also from your Romanian readers. They are quite a lot and also anxious to see the new book coming later this year at the Nemira Publishing House. But first of all, I'm going to start with a question that you have probably heard many, many times, which is the story of your first name, which in Romanian, but also in Latin languages, has a particular significance.
Yes, it's derived from the same source, but the story behind it is that my family goes back to the early American settlements in New England, what we call New England, near Boston. Many of them were Puritans. And there was a tradition among the Puritans in New England that they would name their children after virtues instead of saints, because they believed that the Catholics would typically name their children after saints. And so they wanted to do something different, to be different than the Catholics. And so they named their children after virtues. And yes, because amor comes from love in Latin, the Roman Latin,
yes,
and is in Virgil's Aeneid as a name, briefly. The Puritans picked that up and used it as a name. So in old New England, charity was a woman's name, patience was a woman's name, chastity was a name, courage was a name. And so in this sort of family of names, amor was a name, and so it's a very old family name in my family.
I understand. Tell me, who are the writers you grew up with?
I began both reading. I began reading around first grade and became interested in being a writer at the same time. I think, like many young readers, maybe anywhere, you sort of discover something that really captures your interest, and you initially find reading interesting, but then something really grabs you. And I think that the first reading addiction for me was the Hardy Boys series, which was a group of novels, 50 of them, that were all about two young brothers who were detectives in essence. And each book was a different adventure with a different crime and a different solution. But the two boys were probably 16 and 17 years old or something like that. And they were written back in the 1940s and 50s. But so when I discovered the first Hardy Boys book, and I enjoyed it greatly, then you have that wonderful discovery of, oh my God, there's 50 more. And so I spent a whole summer just reading one after another, after another, after another. And from there, you, as a young person, very young person, probably only 12 or 13 years old, you go through waves of discovering Ray Bradbury, the great American science fiction writer, who I discovered as maybe when I was 16, and reading his work, discovering James Bond novels and reading those, and then eventually becoming a more mature reader, where I was interested in Faulkner and Joseph Conrad and Edith Wharton and the more classical sorts.
There is this story online, at least, about you being 10 and actually throwing a message in a bottle in the Atlantic Ocean. Is it true?
It is a true story, yes.
And the message was?
Well, I was 10 years old, and so the message was not very sophisticated. I think it said, whoever, so I think it said, dear, the person who finds this bottle, I hope the bottle makes it to China. And but then I did come home at the end of the summer and received a letter from an editor of the New York Times who had found the bottle. And he wrote to me saying, I'm sorry, but your bottle did not make it to China. It made it to me. And this journalist named Harrison Salisbury and I corresponded from the time I was 10 until I was 18. And then we met in New York City when I was 18 years old.
This is quite a story. And actually, I would say that the destination appeared to be better than China. Maybe just a bit, yes. Well, you gave up 20 years plus of investments to fully dedicate yourself to writing. Now, my question is, has writing paid you back and let's say compensated this genuine leap of faith?
To clarify, as I mentioned a second ago, I've been writing fiction since I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really all I've ever wanted to do at a serious level. And so I wrote fiction in high school, I wrote it in college, I wrote it in graduate school at Stanford and college at Yale. When I was 25, I moved to New York City with the intention of being a writer. But as you say, I ended up, in order to make a living, joining a friend of mine who had started an investment firm. And we worked together for 20 years. 21 years, and that firm still is thriving and doing well. Along the way, I realized I have to start writing fiction again, or I'm going to be disappointed with myself. So I wrote a novel in my 30s that I didn't like and set aside. And then in my 40s, I wrote Rules of Civility while I still had the job. When that became a bestseller in the United States, I retired from the firm and became a writer full-time. So for me, it wasn't like I quit my job one day and went to become a writer. It was, which would have been brave. I was not that brave because I did the two things side by side. And when the writing had shown itself to be of interest to the American public, at least, it was an easy transition to make. I loved my investment career, but that was really, as I used to say, that was my partner's dream, to run an investment firm, to be in the investment business. This is my dream. These books are my dream. So it was nice sort of after this 20-year career to make the transition where I'm spending all of my available time pursuing my dream of writing novels.
There is an inexhaustible muse that seems to nourish your writings, and that is New York. What makes it so unique?
Well, I don't know if it's New York. I don't know if it's totally unique. There are many cities in Europe, including perhaps your own, which share attributes of New York City.
I would question that a bit,
okay,
yes.
Okay. and of course, what I'm going to say is most of your listeners would know this already, but certainly one of the things that makes New York City unusual is that it really is a city that was built from the beginning by immigration. So there was, from the very first, in the 1600s, you had the British and the Dutch working side by side to build the early city. But in the 19th century, of course, you had this incredible influx of people from throughout Europe, from your country included, but certainly Italians, Germans, Spanish, the English were here already in many ways. But so to have a city which is built by all these various nationalities of, in essence, young people arriving, trying to build a better future for themselves. That's why they come, of course, is with some, rightly or wrongly, imagining that they could build a better future for themselves and their children. It makes the city very unusual in that it continues to be an environment of incredible openness in terms of cultural exchange. It still attracts young people from around the world pursuing different arts and professional careers. So it's full of young, striving individuals, which makes it a city full of ideas and ambition and spirit. And then, of course, you have this very intricate socioeconomic structure in New York. In old France or old Paris, old London, there was pretty clear defined differences as you went up and down the social ladder. The New York ladder gets much more complicated because you have these immigrants, you have people coming from around the world, people who've achieved different levels of success. And so in New York, the socioeconomic strata, the layers, there's not three of them, the rich, the middle class, the working class, there's 30 social strata at least. And each of those stratas has its own sort of behavior, its own style, its own ethics, its own language, its own cuisine, as it were, almost. And so one of the fascinating things about New York is to see that incredible variety of layers of society interacting with each other at the same time that it's individuals from around the world interacting with each other. So I find it a fun place to live.
Unul dintre scriitorii preferați ai lui Barack Obama, Amor Towles este o figură de prim plan în lumea literelor de peste ocean. De altfel, este și frecvent invitat la cele mai vizionate talk show-uri de televiziune. Romanele lui recrează diverse perioade din istoria modernă și o fac cu paletă bogată în culori, fie că se numesc Regulile jocului sau Un gentleman la Moscova.
Your novels have a cinematic dynamic and also charm. How much is instinct? How much is practice?
In terms of the novel itself, or do you mean in particularly in terms of the cinematic quality?
This cinematic quality, this rhythm, this apparent easiness in writing, in telling the story, in intertwining plans.
Yes. For me, and I appreciate that that's the impression that you have of the work, but of course it is the byproduct of very detailed labor on my part, right? Okay. And it begins with a lot of planning. So when I have an idea for a new story, I go into what is, in essence, I call it my design phase, where if an idea captures my attention, Lincoln Highway will be coming out soon for your readers. The Lincoln Highway opens with a very simple premise, which is a young man returning home from a work farm, having been committed a crime as a younger person. He's been to a farm to pay his debt to society. The warden is driving him home at the end of this process, and it turns out that two friends from the work farm, which is basically a prison, have hidden in the trunk of the warden's car and sort of appear with plans that our hero had not anticipated. And the story sort of takes off from there. That's where I began. I had an idea one day of, wouldn't it be interesting if a kid driving home from a juvenile prison suddenly discovered that two friends from the prison were hidden in the trunk of the warden's car and hijacked his future, as it were. When I have an idea like that, if it catches my attention, I will start to imagine every element of that story that I can. Who's there? Why are they there? What are their backgrounds? What happens? Over what period of time? Is this a story that lasts 30 years, like in the case of A Gentleman in Moscow? Is it a story that lasts a year, like in the case of Rules of Civility? Or is it a story that lasts only 10 days, as is the case in the Lincoln Highway? As I say, what do the characters do? Where do they go? What are the various settings like? What are these places like that they stumble into? And so over a period of years, I will basically imagine every aspect of the story in some detail, and I will be writing in notebooks as I tackle different elements of the story. Eventually, I have a very detailed outline, and that's what I use then to start writing chapter one. I will write the book, the first draft. It usually takes me about a year and a half. But then I'll go back to the beginning and I'll revise the book from beginning to end probably about 3 times. And that's very laborious. And a big part of that effort of going back over and over and over the text is to try to make it feel effortless for someone like you, is to take out, to make it seem like it was fresh off of my imagination and coming directly to you in an uninterrupted, smooth, cohesive fashion. But there's a lot of editing, both the planning to set that up, but then the editing to ensure that the writing has a fluid poetry about it.
You seem to have a certain affinity for the first decades of the 20th century. That is obvious both in the first novel as in The Gentleman in Moscow. How would you characterize this specific period of time?
Well, I think what draws me, and you're right, my novels to date have been about the period between, let's say, 1920 and 1960.
1960, yes.
Yeah. So as you say, this, they won't always be set in that time. The book I'm working on now goes all the way up to 1999, but of course now that's almost 25 years ago at this point. But I like writing about 40 years ago, 50 years ago. And the reason that I'm interested in writing about 50 years ago is that, or one of the reasons I enjoy it, is that most of us who are adults have a pretty good sense of what the world was like 50 years ago, but very few of us witnessed it as adults. I mean, so if you were 20 in 50 years ago, it means you're 70 years old now. Right. So the majority of us have a sense of a time period 50, 60, 70 years ago, but no direct experience with that moment. And that's great for me as a fabulist, as a maker up of stories, because by taking this moment 60 years ago, let's say, and if by putting in into the landscape, some landmarks that the contemporary reader will recognize and help them sort of situate themselves in this time that they're only roughly familiar with, I can then start to put in all kinds of elements of the story which are completely made up, and the reader isn't sure whether they're real or not. And I like that reality that they can step into my novel and say 1938, recognize the landscape, gain comfort that they are in 1938 in some way, but not really be sure of, is this a real bar or was this made up? Is this a real event that the characters are going to, or is it made up? So that gives me a lot of flexibility in terms of invention.
Focusing specifically on rules of civility, I also imagined you taking a bow to a golden age of the American literature, probably that particular one when it establishes itself among the greatest creative phases in humankind.
Well, certainly, it is. As a writer, it's always interesting to step into a period that is a rich period culturally. And you're right, in the 1930s, and certainly in New York, but in the United States in whole, you had a variety of artistic modalities that were developing that became very important to Western culture broadly. For instance, not simply the American approach to the modernist novel of Hemingway and Fitzgerald that had ramifications for writers throughout the West, but you had development of jazz in that time, which is obviously a very, very distinctly American musical form that had suddenly listeners around the world and influenced composers and musicians around the world. You have what is known as really the golden age of film. The films of the 1930s are, in some way, it's the peak decade for American cinematic effort, or certainly one of them, where the great stars are coming of age, whether it's Katharine Hepburn or Cary Grant and Fred Astaire. The musicals, the dramas, the comedies, the detective stories are all being explored in film in great detail and in this very glamorous fashion that, again, the entire world took note of. And those movies, those stars became global figures. And so it's very exciting to step into a moment in your own cultural history where all these things are very alive. And in the case of Rules of Civility, both the tenor of that novel, the language of the novel, and to some degree the events are driven by these things. The book, in a way, is in harmony with the films of the 1930s. In terms of the dialogue, for instance, in terms of the style of the way the women behave. But obviously jazz is also an important part of that novel as well, and sort of is playing in the background as the characters sort of gather together and metaphorically influences how the story is told, with a little bit of a feel of improvisation that you might draw from jazz and sort of the mood of jazz. So yes, I like doing that. And in a way, I did a similar thing, but from a different country, in A Gentleman in Moscow, in that the initial spirit that really informs that book, even though it begins in 1922, the hero was born in the 19th century, and he's an aristocrat, and is highly influenced by the great novels of the 19th century, by the great Russian composers of the 19th century. That's what the culture he's inherited, and infuses in a way the tone and language of that book.
You collect fine art and antiques. How do these beats of the past help you configure the future?
It is true. My wife and I both have always had a love for sort of gathering things from different time periods, whether that's art or an objet. And well, here's an example. In the Lincoln Highway, which your community has not really had a chance yet to read, so I will set this up. But in the Lincoln Highway, there's an 8-year-old boy. It's 1954. It's America, and he has a collection that he carries with him as he and his brother end up on the road going from Nebraska to New York City. And it is a collection of silver dollars. And at one point, there's a villainous figure who's trying to steal the silver dollars from our hero and from the young boy, Billy. But they sort of play a role in the course of the story as he carries this collection of silver dollars with him. And what he's collecting is a silver dollar from every year that silver dollars were made in the United States, from the late 19th century up to 1950. So, where does this come from? Well, to some degree, this comes from the fact that my great-grandmother lived until she was 100. And in 1982, when we celebrated her 100th birthday, she gave all of the great-grandchildren one of these, which it's an American silver dollar. Now, if you looked up, it's tarnished, obviously, because of age. But back then they made silver dollars with pure silver. That's what that would be. But this is an 1882 silver dollar, because this was minted the same year that my great-grandmother was born. And so she gave them to all of the great-grandchildren. So I kept this with me ever since. It sits on my desk. It's kind of a reminder of my great-grandmother, and it's sort of a good luck piece. So when I was writing the Lincoln Highway, and I knew that the young boy was going to be a collector and was going to have this collection that he's going to carry with him, I wasn't quite sure what it would be. And I was sort of imagining different things that he might have collected. Butterflies are too fragile. You're not going to be able to carry them with you, or what have you. Maybe soda caps. The tops of soda bottles were at one time very popular. Baseball cards, obviously, were popular to collect. Comic books in the early stages. And so I was imagining different things, and suddenly I was like, well, why not silver dollars? And then that immediately, as soon as I did, I said, oh, that's great, because that's something that somebody else is going to try to take from him, and that becomes sort of adds to the story's structure. And I'll give you just one more example.
Okay.
I'm going to turn my camera here, so I'll carry it. This is because you were asking about art and antiques. This is where I got to get this right. This is a painting which I bought in Paris many years ago, and from the 19th century, or what is it, 18, I should know off the top of my head, 1857 or so. And I don't know who he is. I mean, he was an aristocrat in France in the mid 1800s. I bought that probably 20 years ago. It has been next to my desk ever since. Did he influence my invention of Count Rostov and A Gentleman in Moscow? Almost certainly. And he has sort of a mustache like this, as the Count does at the opening of that. And the Count is always,
actually, yes.
Yeah, and the Count always has sort of a book in his hand, and which he's either reading closely or falling asleep reading, whichever. But so you have this kind of thing sitting there, and my characters in my books are never based on real people. I always do invent them from scratch, but probably I was influenced by this portrait that hangs in my office when I was inventing Count Rostov.
Rules of Civility ends up with a compendium of guidelines for a gentleman of the world. Back then, at the turn of the centuries, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, so appropriate back then, so exotic, I would say, today. Is civility itself obsolete or a fading gem today?
Yeah, it certainly appears to be fading, and it's a very certainly in American society. But I think as we watch press reports from, for instance, from government activity in various capitals of Europe as well, you know, we're seeing the tradition of civility among statesmen, statespeople, is really under duress. The founding fathers in the United States, at least, were very keen about the traditional rules of civility that came out of Europe, you know, and really came out of probably dating all the way back to ideas of of sort of the appropriate behavior for knights in Europe, where the knight not only had to behave well in court, so you had to be polite, and at table you had to have, you know, table manners. You would open a door for a lady, but you also had to be a person of courage and honesty.
Yes.
And in the European tradition, those things were bound together: the polite behavior and the character of integrity, courage, bravery, honesty. And the founding fathers of the United States were very interested in the rules associated with being a gentleman of that sort, that in the 19th century really kind of became the idea of a gentleman of the 18th and 19th century. And they codified that into government. And so when the early Senate met, or when to discuss laws in the United States, it was presumed that every person in that body would speak civilly to each other, and that was essential to the forming of compromises. That the entire American governmental system was based on forming compromises between conservative and liberal viewpoints, for instance. And the only way you can form compromise is by treating each other civilly, assuming that there may be some insight that your opponent has that you have not really considered, and that therefore it's worth pursuing the compromise. In today's world, we're increasingly seeing the willingness of the two sides to speak ill of each other very publicly, which gives you very little reason to try to compromise with each other. Now you just want to win, and whatever you can, gain the majority so you can do whatever you want, as opposed to trying to enter a conversation back and forth in which progress can be made. Now, I'm talking about the government here. But of course, this is something which is happening throughout society as individuals take sides. And so without a doubt, I do think that American society, at any rate, would be in better shape if those traditional values of civility were continue to be pushed forward into the future and honored and aspired to.
There is one particular noun that keeps popping up in relationship to your writings, that is flair. How does one keep the flair of the flare alight?
Yes, and thanks, I like that. You know what, I think one of the reasons I really appreciate that observation, which I take as a compliment, is in the United States, for instance, more than 100,000 novels are published every year, and you know, tens and tens of thousands of them that come into light. How do you write a book that will capture the attention of readers, that will survive, you know, over the decades? And that's really my ambition, is to create a work of literature, a work of art that will engage the reader and provide them not only the satisfaction of reading, but create a world for them to consider that will stimulate their own ideas, their own sentiments, to give them, you know, things to reflect on, and to achieve that with people of different backgrounds, men and women, old and young, rich and poor. You know, that's really the goal of literature, is to create an engaging story that can reach all kinds of different people, yet provide this sort of environment they can retreat into and will spur ideas and thoughts about their own life, about the world, etc. And not just one idea, but a whole slew of ideas. That's the goal. And I think that for a novel to succeed, it has to be built to with that in mind. But at the same time, it has to have flair, because at the end of the day, if we pick up a book and are reading it and it seems flat, if it seems dictatorial, if it seems dull, we're not going to finish it. And if we do finish it, we're not going to recommend it to our children or to our husband or to our friends or to whomever. What distinguishes the books that we do pass on is as I say, they have this ability to entertain us and to reach us, but it has to have sort of a light to it, that the characters have to seem convincing, the prose has to be engaging for us, to seem surprising to some degree, to seem that things are being put in a way that is at once familiar, but we've never quite encountered before. And so that it seems sort of special and gives us an experience as we're reading of feeling like we're in a unique situation suddenly. And all of that is tied, I think, to flair. And sort of tied to what I've was talking about earlier, I think that to capture flair in writing, to protect it, preserve it for the reader, you have to do both of the things that I was talking about earlier. You have to, there's an element in which the design phase, it has to be there, meaning that as you're imagining the story, you have to sort of imagine it with a sense of vividness, and the characters have to be alive to you because you've thought about them enough. You can see them, you can hear them. They're not cut out of paper, as we would say in the United States. They're not puppets. They feel like people because I've imagined them carefully, or hopefully the writer has imagined them carefully enough that they bring them to life. And so that's an aspect of the flair. And to avoid cliche. So to say to yourself, well, I want to have them go out, to talk in a situation, is don't go and create the situation that you've seen in the movies or that you've read in another book. How do you create a situation which seems fresh and unusual in some way? Because that helps bring the moment to life for both me as the writer and hopefully you as the reader. So you have that kind of flair, but then you have the editing process. And ironically, the editing process is very important here, because even though editing is not an art form that flair seems obvious to it, because it's the opposite. It's drudgery, it's boring, it's very specific as you're going through and eliminating one word and choosing another word, or improving a sentence or cutting a paragraph down, all these things. That's very important to the flair of a book, because what you're doing is you're removing the unnecessary parts of the novel and of the language. You're removing the redundancies, you're removing the cliches, you're removing the parts that are irrelevant. And you're constantly trying to strive towards a point where the language has a great economy. It is just as many words are as needed to express this particular moment in time. And that becomes very important to protecting the flair, because if you leave all that other stuff in, it weighs down the reading experience for us. And so, as I say, I do put effort and thought into how do you light the fire in the book, and then how do you protect it and ensure that it's there once, I'm done with the writing process.
Un gentleman la Moscova a fost finalist pentru Kirkus Prize for Fiction și l-a transformat pe dublul absolvent de Stanford și Yale Amor Towles într-un fenomen global. Cel de-al treilea roman al acestuia, The Lincoln Highway, a apărut în 2021 și este așteptat la editura Nemira până la sfârșitul lui 2022.
Once you are done, once you finish a novel, do you still linger in its shade, or you just hurry to cleanse yourself from it and go to a next phase, a new history, a new time, a new topic, a new era?
I am like in Europe too, I assume. In the United States, when a book comes out, if it's well received, you have the chance to go around the country a little bit and speak about the book. And that's a part of the process that I think is important. If I'm going to spend 4 or 5 years writing a book, I should be willing to spend 6 months or a year helping the book, helping readers discover the book.
Yes.
And that means going out and meeting with readers and speaking in lecture halls or what have you. So I do some of that. Now that time, you're going back and talking about the thing you've already written. Right, as you say, you're not yet launching forth. But I tend to, after I've done that for 6 months or so, and I have gone out and spoke about the book, then I'm ready to shift gears. And I do plan books in advance. So I knew 2 years ago what I would be writing today. I knew 3 years ago. And I was doing the designing that I was talking about, filling notebooks, this is what my, the notebook for my new book looks like in the, dates back a couple of years ago as I was beginning to imagine it. And then so in March, I started my new book. So about 6 months after Lincoln Highway came out, I did start chapter 1, and it's very satisfying to be back off into new territory. For those of you who've read my books or who read the first 3 novels, you will realize very quickly that I enjoy changing things. So Lincoln Highway, Rules of Civility, A Gentleman in Moscow are each very different books in terms of the amount of time they describe, in terms of the central character who's at the heart of the story, in terms of sort of the ambiance of the tale. It's very different in all 3. And I do that for a reason, because I really, it forces me as a writer to revisit elements of craft. Because as you go from, say, A Gentleman in Moscow, about an aristocrat who was born in the 19th century, and you go to suddenly the story of Lincoln Highway about 18-year-old boys in America in the 1950s, these 2 stories should sound very different. They should use metaphors should be very different in those stories. The way that the poetry of the language should be very different. The way that ideas are expressed should be very different. The imagery should be different to capture these very different types of life. And that's fun for me, is to be forced as I enter a new story to reinvent the various elements of my craft to serve the new story. So I can't tell you about my 4th novel, which I've started, other than it begins in Cairo in the 40s, it ends in New York in 1999, and it will be different.
How do you reward yourself after typing the end?
Oh, yeah. That's a good question. One of the things, my brother-in-law buys me, there's a type of bourbon in the United States, which is an American whiskey, that is very hard to find. It's very expensive. He always he finds it and buys me a bottle when I start a new book. And I keep it by me and until it's time, until I'm done. And then I get to drink the bourbon, So that's one thing. I love the movies. I love, we're in a great era of long form television here and in Europe. People writing stories that are 6 hours long, 12 hours long. And of course, I love watching, fine film and long form television. But again, that's something like, as soon as I'm done with a book, I go out and I'll watch TV every night, for a couple of months with great pleasure.
Amor Towles, last question. When is the perfect time to have the perfect martini?
Oh, yes. Well, I am of the class where I do have to, it has to be at least after 5 p.m. I'm not a breakfast martini guy. So yeah, 6 o'clock at night seems to me is a perfect time. You don't want to be doing it at 11, right? That's not a good thing to have right before bed, but oh boy, starting a night at 6 o'clock with a martini seems to be a great practice.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Marius. Thank you very much for interviewing me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay. Have a good day. Thank you.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
Doamnelor, domnilor, ediția limitată de astăzi se închide aici. Sunt Marius Constantinescu, citiți nelimitat!